Welcome back, movie buffs. Today, we're exploring a mind-bending sci-fi thriller that'll have you questioning the very fabric of time itself. Meet Joe, a hitman with a twist. He's a looper tasked with eliminating criminals sent back from the future. But after 30 years of service, these loopers have to close their own loop by killing their future selves. The story begins with Joe looking at his compass and checking the time as he awaits the person sent back from another time. The clock finally ticks, and Joe gets in his position by holding his gat, a futuristic blunderbuss shotgun used explicitly for assassinations. Suddenly, a man appears in front of him, and Joe instantly shoots the man, whose face is covered with a cloth. He then turned the dead body around, cut the fabric placed on the dead man's back, and took out the silver bars, which were his payment. According to the timeline, Joe is a looper for a Kansas City crime syndicate. Loopers are contract assassinators who have the job of killing and disposing of the bodies of their victims who are sent from the future. These victims are those who have survived in 2074 and are sent back for their younger selves to kill their older selves. This is a part of their contract that the owner has set for their loop to end. The owner of this crime syndicate only lets its loopers live up to 30 more years, and to end the contract, the owner removes all traces of the loopers, and to do that, the loopers are sent back to the past where their younger selves kill them. The main reason for killing these victims is that the tracing system in 2074 has made it extremely difficult for them to dispose of the bodies without being noticed in the future. So they end these victims in the past to be killed and disposed of. This is a way in which they can finally close their time loop. All this crime syndicate is controlled by an ultimate boss named Abe, who finishes off the contracts with these loopers by sending them back to get assassinated. These loopers are aware that they will not be able to live for more than 30 years, so they spend their remaining life years in luxuries and doing drugs. They use special drugs that make them relive their life to the fullest and forget about their guilt and sadness. It was their only source to forget about their short lifespan and upcoming death. After his job, Joe goes to a diner and happily orders his coffee. After having his coffee, he drives off to a shop to buy a new pack of Jeds for his cat. Joe pays the other man 2 silver bars, and the man gives Joe the Jeds in exchange for the silver. Joe then drives off somewhere, and while driving, Joe finds his friend Seth and an ally who is having trouble with his new bike as it won't start. So Joe offers him a ride, and they both head to La Belle Aurore Bar. Seth has the powers of telekinesis on a very basic level, which may only include being able to float a coin to impress the girls around him. There is only 10% of the population in the world that can use this power. The main reason Joe wanted to go to this bar was to meet Susie, who was a call girl in this bar. She held the utmost importance to Joe. After a few minutes, they arrive at the bar and enter the building from the back door to meet Susie, the girl Joe loves dearly. But unfortunately, upon their arrival, Susie informs Joe that she is busy at the moment. Having no choice, Joe leaves the bar and meets up with his co-worker loopers. At night, Joe's slumber is disturbed by the continuous knocking on his glass window. He walks over to check the source of the noise and opens the window. Suddenly, a panicked Seth appears there. He lets Seth in his apartment, and Seth tells him about his failed assignment. He then tells Joe how he failed his assignment by recognizing his future self as the concealed victim. He then informs Joe that he was about to kill the victim, but he recognized the song the victim was humming, which was the same song his mother used to sing in his childhood. Seth tells him that he couldn't kill his future self due to his hesitation, and his future self took that opportunity to escape from there. Before escaping the future self, Seth informs him about a person named Rainmaker who will soon overthrow the 5 major bosses and close all the loops. Due to his mistake, now the special unit of loopers, Abe's gatemen, are searching for Seth to capture him. While they are both talking, they hear a loud thud from Joe's apartment door, only to find the gateman standing outside to capture Seth. Seth instantly starts begging Joe for help and desperately asks him to hide Seth in his room. Joe is a bit hesitant, but then moves the carpet in his room and reveals a safe under it. He opens the safe and hesitantly lets Seth hide among his tones of collected silver in his silver safe in his room and covers the floor safely. Joe opens the door and Kid Blue aggressively enters the apartment by pointing his gat in all directions in search of Seth. The other loopers of Gateman also enter Joe's apartment and search for any traces of Seth, but have no luck in finding him. Kid Blue then informs Joe that he will be talking to Abe while they will guard his apartment. Later, Joe goes to the headquarters of Abe where he is inquired about the whereabouts of Seth. Joe refuses to say anything, but then Abe threatens Joe to take away half the silver bars that Joe has collected over time if he doesn't reveal Seth's whereabouts. Joe is suddenly in a tough spot as his biggest dream is to move to France and live his life in peace and spend his remaining life happily, which is why he is collecting silvers and is learning their language. At this moment, Joe betrays Seth and reveals his location in his apartment to save his silver bars. Joe has been collecting these silver bars for a long, so he chooses his dream over friendship and lets his friend get the punishment. Abe's gatemen immediately head to Joe's apartment to capture Seth from his hiding spot. After they have captured him, they brutally cut a bloody address on his arm and sever his body. The same effect happens to the future body of Seth. This reveals the fact that if the past body is injured, the same effect takes place on the future body. So to eliminate the future Seth, the gatemen kill the present Seth. The future Seth then gives up on escaping and tries to get to the address tattooed on his arm. With his body continuously breaking down, he waddles his way to the location. Upon his arrival, Kid Blue shoots him as soon as he arrives in that location. Feeling the heavy guilt of killing his friend, Joe visits the bar La Bella Aurora to meet up with Susie. He opens up to Susie about his pain and suffering for killing his friend, but instead, Susie gives him some drugs in the form of eye drops to let him ease his depressed state. Joe then expresses his feelings to Susie and asks her to join him. He even offers Susie half his amount of silver to move out of town and live with him, but she rejects his offers and tells him that she has everything she needs right here in the town. She refuses to leave with him as her desires and wishes are all being sufficed by her current job. She refuses to leave with Joe and rejects his offer of carrying Joe's son or spending her life with him. She then leaves Joe lying there on the bed. The next day, Joe goes to the address given to him and waits for his clock to tick. This time, when he is about to shoot the person appearing in front of him, he stops his movements as he sees a victim appearing with his face uncovered and arms not tied up. At first, he observes the facial features of the victim and feels that they are familiar to him, and soon it dawns on him that the old victim in front of him is his future self. The present Joe tries to kill the future Joe, but fails as the future Joe turns his back to the shot, and instead of getting shot, the gold on his back is shot, and the older Joe saves himself by throwing the gold bars at the present Joe. The older Joe then hits the younger Joe and knocks him unconscious. When the present Joe wakes up later, he finds a paper attached to his back. The message written on it instructed Joe to pop on a train and leave the town, but instead, Joe ignores this message. Joe then goes back to his apartment, only to find the gatemen had ransacked his apartment and were searching his silver bars. He quickly attacks them, traps Kid Blue in the floor safe, and deals with the rest of the gatemen. Unfortunately, while he is trying to escape from the window, he falls from the fire escape and blacks out. In another timeline, Joe killed his older self and moved to Shanghai as according to Abe's suggestion, using his silver bars. After settling there, he becomes a hitman and lives a wild life. To fulfill his drug addiction, Joe adopts a violent lifestyle, but all that changes when he meets the love of his life, his wife, who helps him get over his drug addiction and changes him for good. All the peaceful memories comes to an end after a few years when it was the end of Joe's 30 years of service. Abe's men barge into his house, kill Joe's wife, and drag him to a location where he would be sent back to get executed. But he manages to beat the other men and travels back to 2044 by himself, where his memories are vaguely connected to the present Joe. He can see what the current Joe has done in his past and what actions present Joe has taken. He suddenly looks at his arm to see a wound scar on his skin and realizes that his body will get the impact of any harm done to the present Joe's body. He will get hurt if the younger self gets hurt. He then gathers a few medical supplies from a medical store and goes to the present Joe's location and finds him unconscious. He then kills the last gatemen's members and escapes with the present Joe. On the other hand, Abe and his men are trying to devise a plan to capture both Joes. The future Joe then goes to a library and uses a super advanced computer to look for something. He has some letters written in his hand. He searches them and it pops out some information about 3 babies. He then prints out the location of these 3 babies suspected of being rainmakers. The next day, old Joe meets young Joe at the diner. The air around them is very intense until a young lady comes over to them and takes their order. Both the Joes have indifferent feelings towards each other, and they both share a heavy and complicated conversation. Old Joe expresses his intentions of killing the Rainmaker as a child in the present time and changing his future. The young Joe completely disagrees with the plan, but then older Joe explains that he was in deep love with his wife, and he only desires to spend more time with her, and this is the reason why he wants to kill the Rainmaker, as the Rainmaker orders to kill his wife and send older Joe back in time to get assassinated. The young Joe starts to understand the old Joe's intention when the older Joe explains to him how important his wife was to him and how he wishes to see her alive again in his timeline, but the only way that could be possible is only if the Rainmaker doesn't exist in his timeline. The older Joe is adamant about killing the Rainmaker and asks the young Joe to accompany him, but the younger Joe again disagrees and argues that he will just marry another woman to avoid his future wife getting killed. Younger Joe warns the older Joe that he won't let the older Joe to escape from the diner alive. They both have a heated argument, and the older Joe dares the younger Joe to use his gun to kill him, but the younger Joe is careful of his surroundings and remains calm. Their argument gets more intense and it ends up in a gunfight. This alerted the Gap men outside the diner, who rushed to capture them. The gatemen tried to capture them, but failed as both the Joes escaped into the fields. Both Joes follow different parts of their maps, and the younger Joe finds himself on a farm occupied by a woman named Sarah and her son Sid. Young Joe is hidden in the fields while Sarah is cooking. Sarah hears some unusual noises and stops cooking. She locks the doors of her house and sees Joe in the field. She immediately grabs her shotgun. She then goes out and demands the intruder show himself, but Joe keeps hiding inside the field. Later in the evening, Joe feels the withdrawal symptoms of the drugs and feels weak. He feels the need to withdraw, but he calms himself down and prevents himself from collapsing. He suddenly sees Sarah pointing a gun at someone. Thinking she might be in trouble, Joe has no other choice but to move between them. He gets in front of Sarah, purposely trying to protect her from any possible dangers. He then moves between them only to find that the other man is a beggar who is asking for money, and the young Joe collapses due to the withdrawal symptoms. Sarah sees Joe and rushes to help him. After this, Joe throws up in front of her and Sarah slaps him to get him in his right mind. Sarah then asks him what his last time of withdrawal was. After that, she gives Joe some water to freshen up and to get him in his senses. Sid then walks out and sees a man outside his house. Sarah then helps Joe, and the next day, Joe wakes up and finds himself handcuffed in the barn. He is handcuffed by Sarah and wakes up hazy. Sid, who was accompanying Sarah while she made breakfast, informs her that Joe is now awake. She halts her work in the kitchen and takes her shotgun with her to inquire about Joe's whereabouts. She goes over to him to check up on him and points her shotgun at him to answer her questions. Afterward, she hands him the handcuff keys and inquires about his identity and purpose. Instead of leaving, Joe hands her the map showing the information and location of her son on the map. Sarah grabs the map and reads it only to find out that the numbers present on the map are actually the birth dates of Sid and the location where Sid was born. When Joe explains the situation and tells her about the information written on the map, almost immediately after seeing the information about Sid on the map, Sarah shoots him twice without hesitation. She again loads her ammo and asks Joe about his intentions and plans. Joe then tells her that time travel is not invented yet, but in a few years it will be invented, and in the next 30 years, it will be used by big criminal syndicates. Sarah, who was listening intently, interrupts Joe and guesses Joe to be a looper, and Joe agrees. He then further explains to her and reveals that he is a looper and his future self wants to kill Sid. As Sarah calms down, Joe tells her about the plan of his older self and explains that the older Joe wanted to kill all 3 children born in that hospital on the same day as he himself wasn't sure which one of the kids was going to turn into the Rainmaker. He then explains that after killing the Rainmaker, his older self will vanish from this timeline and return back to his wife in the future, as there will be no Rainmaker who will order the ending of loops, and the older Joe will be able to reunite with his wife again. He promises Sarah that he will protect her and Sid. Meanwhile, on the other hand, the older Joe mercilessly shoots an innocent child, his first suspect on his list, right outside the suspect's house. Afterwards, the older Joe cries very hard, feeling terrible and full of guilt after killing an innocent child. Days pass by and Joe keeps his word to Sarah to protect her and Sid from his older self. Over the passage of time, Joe gets closer to Sarah, and he feels that his relationship with Sid is getting stronger, and he feels like Sid is greatly attached to Joe. Eventually, Sid confesses one of his dark secrets to Joe. Sid told Joe that he was aware of what happened to his biological mom and that Sarah lied to him about his mother's death. The next day, one of the Gap men named Jesse arrives at the farm and knocks on the door of the farmhouse and asks Sarah for some water and about her family members in the house. He asked her to let her in the house. Having no choice, she lets him enter the house and talks to him while Sid and the young Joe successfully hide using the tunnel made by Sid's grandfather. At night, the atmosphere for Sarah and Joy gets a bit intense. Soon enough, Sarah and Joe hit off with their romance and their night together. Later, Sarah reveals to Joe that she has telekinetic powers like some other people in the world. There are only 10% of the people in the world that can use telekinetic powers, but Sarah reveals that her powers are a bit higher than an average telekinetic user. She then reveals that Sarah is the biological sister of Sid's mother and that Sid also has these powers in him through genes. She tells Joe that she wants to keep Sid out of trouble because she knows that Sid's powers are even more potent and dangerous than hers. The next day, Joe wakes up to an empty bed and walks down only to find Jesse, one of the gatemen, holding Sarah at gunpoint. Joe tries to talk to Jesse peacefully, but Jesse accidentally points the gun at Sid, who is top of the stairs. Being startled by the sudden gesture, Sid flinches and falls down the stairs. Joe tries to catch Sid but is unable to do so. Sid then gets up from the ground with only a few minor injuries and uses his powers to kill Jesse. Joe tries to get closer to Sid, but Sarah pushes Joe to run outside and save themselves. Meanwhile, Sid uses his telekinetic powers and kills Jesse. When Joe and Sarah are outside, Joe pushes her to the ground, inquiring if Sid was the one who killed his mother, and Sarah reluctantly says yes. Sarah then informs Joe about Sid's mother's death. She explains that Sid fell from a bookshelf in the past and was startled, and his powers killed his mother. It was now clearly evident that Sid was the kid who would become the Rainmaker in the future. Upon realizing that Sid will become the Rainmaker, Joe tells Sarah that the old Joe must have known about this too. Joe advises her to move to the city as soon as possible to avoid Sid getting killed. On the other hand, Kid Blue is successful in catching the older Joe and brings him to Abby. But before he can do anything, future older Joe manages to break free from Kid Blue and goes berserk. He grabs some guns and attacks everyone. He finally manages to kill Abe and his men there, and afterward, he escapes from there and drives to the farm where Sid and Sarah are trying to run away. Knowing Sarah and Sid's location through the memories of the present Joe, the older Joe manages to get to the farm to kill Sid. Without him knowing, Kid Blue also follows him and, despite being shot once, manages to track down the Joes. Despite being shot in his leg, he manages to catch up with both the Joes by riding the slap bike. He then engages in a continuous gunfight in an attempt to kill them but fails to do so. Before he can kill both, Joe manages to end him first. Finally, the old Joe finds Sarah and Sid trying to escape in their car and shoots down the car. The older Joe then starts shooting Sid and Sarah. The older Joe had already finished the other targets. After their car crashes, Sarah and Sid quickly get out of the car. In a panicking situation, Sarah guides Sid to run through the field while the older Joe is still far from them. But older Joe again catches up with them and uses his gun to shoot them continuously. Unfortunately, one of the bullets hits Sarah and she is injured in the field. Sid witnesses Straw getting shot and immediately stops. While the innocent kid is still processing the situation, he is suddenly shot and the bullet grazes his cheek. Terrified, Sid stands up and activates his powers. The intensity of his powers is so intense that the ground starts shaking. Sarah was afraid that Sid could easily kill her with his intense powers. She then talks to Sid, and before any destruction can have happened, Sid is calmed down by Sarah, who knows that Sid's powers can be deadly without them even realizing. Sid calms down and she quickly orders Sid to go and hide inside the fields and shields him with her body by blocking the view of old Joe's gun range. The older Joe points his gun at her and threatens to kill her. At that exact moment, the young Joe arrives there and witnesses the situation. He sees the older Joe pointing the gun at Sarah and finds the little boy Sid hiding behind the crane fields. He realizes that if old Joe kills Sarah in front of Sid, Sid will definitely become a rainmaker. Young Joe knew that this situation was very unfavorable for him, but for the sake of saving the future, young Joe makes a huge decision. He looks at the gun near him and looks back at the situation again and grabs the gun beside him. Having no choice, young Joe holds the gun to his chest and shoots himself to save Sarah and Sid. His sacrifice saved both Sarah and Sid, and he was finally able to prevent Sid from becoming a rainmaker. He shoots himself, and this results in the older Joe dying as well. As this was the main link between the present and the past body, that the pain felt by the present body will be reflected in the future body. Luckily, the young Joe finally manages to save Sarah, preventing Sid from becoming the rainmaker. In the end, Sarah carries the young Sid and runs towards young Joe's body and mourns his death. This is how young Joe managed to make his life's biggest and bravest sacrifice.